The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. Amara Cole sat alone in the dark. No lights. No music. Just the cold silence of a house that had stopped feeling like a home a long time ago. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. But her eyes held something that no amount of composure could hide. Years. Layers. A kind of quiet suffering that had been folded so many times it had become invisible to everyone around her. Everyone except her. She looked at the screen. One name. One number. A call she had been delaying for months. From the hallway, she could still hear the echo of his voice from earlier that evening, sharp, dismissive, final. The way it always was. The way it had been for years. She had said nothing. She never did. And he had walked away, as he always did, completely certain of his superiority, completely blind to the truth. She pressed accept. Ma'am. The voice on the other end was professional. Precise. We've been waiting. Do we proceed with the acquisition? Amara closed her eyes. One word. That was all it would take. One word and everything Richard Cole had built, the empire, the image, the man the world called a visionary, would begin to dissolve like sugar in rain. She opened her eyes. Not yet, she said quietly. The line went silent. Then, understood, ma'am. We'll stand by. She ended the call, placed the phone face down on the table, and sat back in her chair. Outside, the city moved. Cars passed. Somewhere, a dog barked. The world continued, unbothered, unaware that in this dim and quiet room, a woman was deciding the fate of $1 billion empire. And she hadn't even raised her voice. Before we dive deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this one don't come around often. Stay with us. You're going to want to see how this ends. To understand who Amara Cole really was, you have to go back. Not to the night she made the call. Not to the public humiliation or the boardroom panic or the moment the stock started shifting. You have to go back to a small apartment on the east side of the city, 14 years before any of this happened, where a 26-year-old woman sat across from a man who looked at her like she was the most interesting person he had ever encountered. Richard Cole, at that time, was not yet the man the world would come to know. He was smart, yes. Ambitious, absolutely. But he was also struggling. His first company was bleeding money. His investors were getting nervous. His ideas were bigger than his execution, and the gap between what he imagined and what he could actually build was becoming impossible to ignore. But he had charm. An extraordinary, almost magnetic charm. The kind that made you feel, when he turned his full attention toward you, that nothing else existed in the world. That evening, he turned it on Amara. She was not naive. She had grown up watching her father build and lose 2 businesses before quietly rebuilding a third. She understood money not as something glamorous but as something structural, like the foundation of a building. You don't see it, but without it, everything collapses. By the time she was 24, she had already made her first significant investment through a private trust her father had helped her establish. By 26, she had doubled it twice. Nobody knew this about her. She preferred it that way. What the world saw was a composed, elegant woman who was careful with her words and generous with her attention. What Richard saw, that evening, was someone he could talk to. Someone who actually listened. And what Amara saw in Richard was potential, raw, undisciplined, burning potential wrapped in a man who desperately needed direction. She told herself it was intellectual curiosity that drew her to him. She was lying to herself. She loved him. Completely. Without condition. They married 18 months later. It was, by every external measure, a beautiful match. He was the face. She was the force. He moved through rooms with energy and presence while she operated quietly behind every major decision, every strategic pivot, every relationship that would matter. She introduced him to the right people. She identified the right markets. She moved resources through her private trust in ways that stabilized his company during its most vulnerable years, all without ever appearing in a single document, a single filing, a single press release. She didn't want credit. She wanted him to succeed. That, it turned out, was her first mistake. Because the version of Richard Cole the world came to admire, the visionary CEO, the self-made billionaire, the man who gave interviews about discipline and sacrifice and building something from nothing, was, in no small part, a construction. A real construction, built with real effort and real intelligence. But a construction nonetheless that had invisible load-bearing walls she had quietly placed, one by one, over the course of nearly a decade. And he had forgotten they were there. Or perhaps, more accurately, he had decided to forget. The shift was not sudden. That is the thing about this kind of cruelty. It does not arrive fully formed. It does not knock on the door and announce itself. It seeps in. It starts with something small, a dismissive comment at a dinner party. A look that says you're embarrassing me without using any words. A moment where he talks over her and then catches himself, but doesn't apologize. And she lets it go. Because she loves him. Because she thinks it's stress. Because everyone has bad days and successful people carry enormous pressure and she knows better than anyone what he has been through to get to where he is. But the small things compound. A year later, he is no longer catching himself. 2 years later, he is not even aware there is anything to catch. You wouldn't understand how business works, Amara. He said it one evening while she was standing in the kitchen reading a financial report, one of 3 she had reviewed that morning. His CFO had called her privately earlier that day because there was a structural issue in one of the subsidiary accounts and, as always, she had quietly resolved it before it could become a headline. But Richard didn't know that. As far as he was concerned, she was just there. A decoration. A convenient presence at events who smiled and shook hands and then stayed out of the way. You just don't have the instinct for it, he continued, pouring himself a drink. Some people do and some people don't. It's nothing personal. It's just how it is. She set the report face down on the counter. You're probably right, she said softly. He nodded, satisfied, and walked out of the room. She stood there for a long moment. Then she picked up the report and continued reading. She was circling an anomaly in the numbers that, if left unaddressed, would have cost his company $47 million within the next fiscal quarter. She addressed it the following morning. Anonymously. As always. By the time Richard announced the merger, the deal that every financial publication called the defining move of his career, the abuse had escalated in ways that were harder to quantify but impossible to ignore. It was not physical. Let that be understood. This story is not about bruises. It is about something that in some ways leaves a deeper mark, the systematic, daily erosion of a person's sense of their own reality. The way someone can make you feel, through tone and implication and the strategic weaponizing of silence, that you are less than you know yourself to be. She was excluded from conversations she should have been part of. She was contradicted in front of others on matters she knew better than anyone in the room. She was laughed at, not openly, but with the kind of subtle, sideways amusement that is designed to look like affection while actually functioning as contempt. At events, he introduced her as my wife, Amara, with a particular flatness, a tone that communicated she had no other relevant attribute. As though being his wife were the only thing about her worth mentioning. As though she had arrived in the world the day they got married and had no history, no substance, no interior life of her own. She watched him work the room. She watched him tell stories about sacrifice and vision and building things from nothing. She watched people lean toward him, drawn in by that extraordinary charm, and she thought, not with bitterness, but with a kind of clear-eyed sorrow, that the story he was telling was not entirely false. He had worked hard. He had taken real risks. He had genuine talent. But the story was incomplete. and he knew it was incomplete. And knowing that, she believed, was part of what drove his cruelty. Not that he was a bad person at his core, though that was becoming harder to believe, but that somewhere inside him, he understood that his version of himself required her erasure. She couldn't be visible. Because if she was visible, so was the truth. The merger was announced at a press conference in March. Richard stood before 40 journalists in a glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of his headquarters and described it as the culmination of 7 years of strategic work. He said the word "I" 43 times. Amara counted. She watched from home on her laptop. When he came home that night, he was electric with excitement. Champagne, laughter, phone calls. He barely looked at her. "Big day," she said, when he finally settled. "The biggest," he said, already looking at his phone. "Congratulations." "Thanks." He scrolled. Didn't look up. She sat with her tea and said nothing else. That night, after he slept, she opened her laptop. She reviewed the structure of the merger. She saw what the press hadn't seen. She saw what even some of the board hadn't seen yet. The deal, as structured, had a critical vulnerability. A particular clause in the acquisition agreement that, if certain conditions were triggered, would allow the primary silent stakeholder to force a dissolution. She was the primary silent stakeholder. She had been, for 11 years. She closed the laptop. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark beside her husband, who was breathing easily, confident in his dominance of a world he only partially understood, and she stared at the ceiling and asked herself the only question that mattered. What am I waiting for? The honest answer was something she had been avoiding for a long time. She was waiting for him to become the person she had married. She was waiting for the charm to stop being a performance and start being real again. She was waiting for one moment, one look, one word, one gesture, that reminded her of the man who had sat across from her in a small apartment and made her feel like the most interesting person he had ever met. She was waiting for something that was not coming. She knew this. She had known it for a long time. But knowing a thing and accepting it are not the same. The dinner was a charity event for a children's hospital foundation. 300 people. Round tables with white linen and candles. A night that was, on the surface, exactly the kind of event Amara attended easily, quiet, composed, observant. She was good at these evenings. She always had been. She wore a deep blue dress and her hair was pulled back simply. She sat beside Richard at the principal table, next to 2 board members, a senator, and the senator's wife. The conversation was pleasant. Politics, philanthropy, real estate. The senator's wife was warm and funny, and Amara found herself genuinely engaged. She made a comment about the funding structure of hospital foundations, a fairly technical observation drawn from work she had done years earlier, and the senator's wife leaned forward, interested. That's fascinating. Did you work in healthcare finance? Before Amara could answer, Richard turned from his conversation and said, with a light, easy smile, Amara reads a lot. She's very well informed for someone who's never actually worked in finance. A beat of silence. The senator's wife blinked. Amara felt it. The whole table felt it. That particular species of cruelty disguised as humor, sharp enough to cut, vague enough to deny. She smiled. Yes, she said pleasantly. I read a great deal. The conversation moved on. Richard turned back to his discussion. The senator's wife gave Amara a look, brief, sympathetic, uncomfortable, and then also moved on. Amara picked up her glass of water and drank slowly. Something settled in her chest. Not anger. Not yet. But something colder and more permanent. The feeling of a decision being made not by the conscious mind but by something deeper, some fundamental mechanism of self-preservation that had been patient for an extraordinarily long time and had just, quietly, run out of patience. She excused herself after dessert. She stood in the tiled corridor outside the event hall, alone, and she took 3 slow breaths. Then she took out her phone and sent a message. 3 words, begin the review. A response came back in under a minute. Understood. We'll have the full assessment ready within 72 hours. She put the phone away. She walked back into the event, sat beside her husband, and smiled for the rest of the evening. If you're still watching up to now, type "I'm still here" in the comment section. This story is just getting started. The 72 hours were the quietest of her life. She went about everything as normal. She made breakfast. She had a call with her private advisor. She attended a gallery opening. She slept, or tried to. She watched Richard move through his days with the particular confidence of a man who believes his position is unassailable, and she said nothing. She offered no signals. She gave him nothing to read. This was not strategic silence. This was natural. Amara had always been quiet. She had always understood that information is most powerful when it is contained, that leverage means nothing if deployed without precision, and that patience is not weakness, it is the sharpest edge in any conflict. But she was also, beneath the composure, grieving. Because this was not a business decision. This was the end of something she had built with her own hands. Not a company. A life. A marriage she had believed in, invested in, shaped and protected and held together during years when it might have collapsed entirely. She was not destroying an enemy. She was dismantling something that had once been the most important thing she had. That is a different kind of task. On the third night, she received the full report. She read it alone at the dining room table while Richard attended a dinner meeting. Every page confirmed what she already knew. Her position in the structure was absolute. The merger, as designed, could not proceed without her approval. And with a single instruction, she could not only withdraw that approval but trigger the dissolution clause, reversing the deal, destabilizing the financing structure, and forcing a full regulatory review that would take at minimum 18 months and cost Richard's company its most valuable acquisition window. The empire would not collapse overnight. He was not without resources. But the damage would be significant, lasting, and very, very public. She closed the report and placed it in the drawer. When Richard came home an hour later, she was in bed, reading. "Good meeting?" she asked. "Excellent," he said, loosening his tie. "Everything's moving exactly as I planned." She nodded and turned a page. "Good," she said. "I'm glad." He didn't ask about her day. He never did anymore. The board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday, 64 days after the merger announcement. Richard had described it publicly as a formality, a final alignment of paperwork before the official close. The financial press was already writing congratulatory pieces. His publicist had arranged a cover story. There were celebration dinners being planned. She called her advisor Wednesday evening. "Tomorrow?" he asked. "Tomorrow," she said. "You're certain?" A pause. Not hesitation. Just the weight of the moment being properly acknowledged. "Yes," she said. "I'm certain." "Amara," he stopped. "Then, I just want to say that what you've carried, for how long you've carried it, the restraint has been extraordinary. Most people would have acted far sooner." "Most people act from anger," she said. "I wanted to act from clarity." He was quiet for a moment. "Proceed," she told him. "Everything is discussed." She put the phone down and sat in the stillness of the house. Somewhere upstairs, Richard was on a call, laughing about something. His voice moved through the ceiling in fragments. An old sound. A familiar one. She remembered a version of that laugh from 14 years ago in a small apartment on the east side. How it had made the room feel warmer. How she had thought, listening to it, that a life built alongside that sound might be a life worth building. She breathed through the grief of what could have been. And she let it go. The meeting convened at 9 in the morning. 23 people in a glass-walled boardroom on the 42nd floor. Lawyers, executives, financial advisors, representatives from both sides of the deal. Coffee in white cups. Ties and tailored suits. The quiet, expensive efficiency of power being formally consolidated. Richard sat at the head of the table. He had never looked more assured. His posture, his voice, his expression, everything communicated that this was his moment, his achievement, his proof. He opened the meeting by thanking everyone in the room for their contributions to a deal he described as historic. 20 minutes in, the first signal arrived. One of the junior associates leaned toward the lead lawyer and whispered something. The lawyer's expression shifted, barely, almost imperceptibly, but to anyone paying attention it was visible. He checked his phone. His jaw tightened. Richard continued speaking, unaware. 5 minutes later, the associate passed a printed document down the table to the lead financial advisor. The advisor read the first paragraph. Then he read it again. Then he looked up at the ceiling briefly, the way people do when they are processing information that requires a moment to absorb. The lead lawyer quietly excused himself from the table and stepped out. Richard noticed but misread it as routine. While Marcus steps out, he said smoothly, "Let's continue with the secondary terms." The room was complying, but something had changed in its temperature. A low frequency, almost imperceptible unease. Marcus, the lead lawyer, returned 4 minutes later. He moved directly to Richard and bent down and said something in a very low voice. Richard's expression did not break immediately. He was too experienced for that. But some light, shifted in his eyes. "Excuse me a moment," he said to the room. He stepped out. The boardroom descended into the particular charged quiet of people who understand that something has gone wrong but are professionally obligated to pretend otherwise. Conversations in small groups. Phones being checked discreetly. The body language of collective anxiety being managed. In the corridor, Richard stood with Marcus and 2 other advisors. "What do you mean withdrawn?" His voice was controlled but tight. "The principal stakeholder has invoked the review clause," Marcus said carefully. "They have withdrawn conditional approval pending restructure evaluation." "That's not possible." "We have the signatures." "We have the initial signatures were conditional upon final approval from the silent stakeholder. That approval has been formally withdrawn as of 6:47 this morning." Marcus paused. "Richard, we need to talk about who this stakeholder is." "A beat." "We have never had formal confirmation of identity," Marcus continued. "But the communication came through the Cole Private Trust, the one established 14 years ago in." Richard went very still. The corridor felt like it had gotten smaller. "That's impossible," he said. His voice had changed. The control was still there, but underneath it something was fracturing. "That trust is." "The trust is held by Amara Cole," Marcus said. Gently. As though he were delivering a diagnosis. "She is the principal stakeholder. She has been since the beginning." The silence that followed lasted a long time. She was at home when he called. She was sitting in the living room with a cup of tea, the same room, the same chair, the same cup she had used on dozens of ordinary mornings. She let it ring twice before answering. "Is it true?" His voice was unrecognizable. All the texture had been stripped from it. It was just raw sound. "Is what true, Richard?" "Don't." A pause. His breathing was audible. "Don't do that. Just tell me if it's true." She set the cup down. "Yes," she said. Another silence. "Longer." "How long?" "Since before we married. Your first company was failing. Do you remember the private bridge loan that came through in the spring of that year? The one that stabilized your cash position long enough for you to close the Henderson deal? The one your financial advisor told you came from a discretionary fund with no attached conditions?" She could hear him breathing. "That was me," she said. "I've been there from the beginning." "Why?" His voice broke slightly and he steadied it. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you never asked." A pause. "And because I wanted you to succeed. I didn't want credit. I wanted to see you build something real." So this whole time, I have protected you. I have directed resources toward your stability in 6 separate moments of financial crisis in the last 11 years. I have never once interfered with your decisions or attempted to influence your direction. I have been exactly what I wanted to be, someone who made sure the foundation held, quietly, while you built. He said nothing. And you looked at me, she continued, her voice still steady, still quiet, in front of a table full of people, and told them I was well informed for someone who had never worked in finance. The silence on the line had a texture she had never heard from him before. It felt like the particular silence of a man confronting the size of what he didn't know he didn't know. Amara. I'm not angry, Richard. And she meant it. I want you to understand that. I'm not doing this from anger. I'm doing this because I finally understand that staying was never going to change anything. And because I deserve more than invisible. You can't dissolve 11 years because of. I'm not dissolving 11 years. I'm ending a marriage that dissolved a long time ago. You just didn't notice, because you weren't paying attention to me. A beat. Come home, she said. We'll talk properly. No lawyers yet. No boardrooms. Just us. This conversation deserves more than a phone call. He came home an hour later. She was still in the same chair. She had made fresh tea. She had not called anyone. She had not prepared an argument or a list or a strategy. She simply sat in the room that had stopped feeling like hers a long time ago and waited for him. He came through the door and stood in the doorway of the living room looking at her as though he was seeing her for the first time. He looked, she thought, diminished. Not in a satisfying way. Just truthfully. Like a building after you've removed the false facade and you can see the actual structure underneath, smaller than you thought, more ordinary. He sat down across from her. Tell me everything, he said. She did. Not with cruelty. Not with the list of grievances she could have recited from memory. She told him the financial history. She told him what she had done and when and why. She told it clearly, factually, without drama. Because it did not need drama. The facts were extraordinary enough on their own. He listened. He didn't interrupt. At several points she could see him doing the mathematics, running the numbers against his memory, finding the moments that now looked different in this new light. His first funding round. The restructured debt from the 3rd year. The introduced partnership that had unlocked the European market. All of it. All of her. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. I thought I built this myself, he finally said. His voice was flat. Not aggressive. Just empty. You did build it, she said. The decisions were yours. The leadership was yours. The vision, for whatever it became, was yours. I built the floor you were standing on. You built everything above it. Both things are true. Then why, he stopped. He tried again. Why would you withdraw now? After everything? She looked at him directly. Because the floor is gone now, Richard. Not the company. The floor is gone because there's nothing left holding up this marriage. You removed it so gradually that I don't think you even noticed it leaving. A pause. But I noticed. He looked at his hands. The dinner, he said. The dinner was one moment among many. But yes. I didn't mean it like. You did. She said it without heat. You meant it exactly like that. Because it's how you see me. And I understand when that changed, and I understand why. Success does things to people, and I watched it do things to you that I kept hoping were temporary. But they weren't temporary. They're just you now. And I can't stay in a life built around the version of myself that someone else decided I was. He looked at her for a long moment. What happens now? He asked. To the deal. The review will take time. Your team will need to restructure certain terms. It's not fatal if handled correctly. Your advisors are capable and the underlying business is sound. And us? She stood. She smoothed her jacket. She picked up her cup and held it for a moment. "There is no us, Richard," she said, not unkindly. "There hasn't been for a while. We've just been the last two people to say it out loud." She walked toward the door. "Amara." She stopped but didn't turn. "I'm sorry," he said. I know it doesn't fix anything. But I am." She stood very still. "I know you are," she said quietly. "I believe you. I hope it means something for whoever comes next." Then she walked out. The story that broke 48 hours later was unlike anything the financial press had encountered in years. The identity of the silent stakeholder in the coal corporation empire, a trust held by the CEO's wife, established 14 years earlier, representing an 11-year history of strategic investment and protection, became the lead story on every major platform. The headline wrote itself. The questions wrote themselves. How had nobody known? How had a woman with this level of influence remained entirely invisible for over a decade? The answer was simple, and it was the part that the press struggled most to convey. She had not wanted to be seen. She had wanted something else entirely. And when the thing she had wanted became impossible, she had made the only decision that remained. Richard Cole survived it. He was too capable not to. The merger took 14 months to restructure and eventually closed at different terms. The cover story was delayed. The celebration dinners were quietly canceled and rescheduled. He gave a press conference that was, to his credit, unusually honest. He acknowledged the complexity of the structure and the role of the trust without providing details that were not his to share. He came across as diminished but not broken. He rebuilt, in the way that capable and lucky people tend to rebuild. But the story was no longer his. Amara gave one interview. A single conversation with a journalist she had met years earlier at a hospital foundation event, a thoughtful woman who had covered economic inequality for 2 decades. It ran in a long-form feature that was shared widely. In it, she said very little about Richard. She talked about the nature of invisible work. About the systems that allow some people's contributions to be absorbed without attribution. About the ways that love, in its most generous expressions, can make you complicit in your own erasure. About what it means to be effective versus visible, and the moment a person realizes that the distinction between the two has been used against them. She was asked if she felt powerful. She thought about it for a long time. "I feel clear," she said. "I've been clear for a while. I think I just finally let the clarity mean something. There's a moment in most people's lives, not everyone reaches it, but it exists for everyone, when the story they have been telling themselves about who they are and what they deserve comes into direct conflict with reality. The question is not whether that moment arrives. It's what you do when it does." Amara Cole endured 1,000 small violences in the years of her marriage. 1,000 moments where she was made to feel smaller than she was. 1,000 mornings where she absorbed what had been done to her the night before and chose to continue, to believe, to hold on to something that had already let go of her. She was not a fool. She was not weak. She was a woman who loved someone completely and spent years learning the difficult truth that love, by itself, is not enough, and that continuing to give it freely to someone who has stopped valuing it is not generosity. It is loss. What she chose, finally, was not revenge. The story is not about revenge. It is about something quieter and more durable than revenge. It is about a woman who, in the middle of a dinner where she had been mocked in front of a senator and a senator's wife and 20 other people who pretended not to notice, felt something settle in her chest and made a decision, not to destroy, but to stop protecting someone who had long since stopped protecting her. She walked away with nothing she did not already have before she met him. Her trust. Her privacy. Her clarity. She asked for no recognition. She sought no public vindication. She sat in one interview and spoke carefully and honestly, and then she went back to her life, the interior, invisible, extraordinary life she had always been living, and she continued. She continued. That, perhaps, is the most radical thing she did. Not the call. Not the dissolution clause. Not the restructured merger or the financial fallout or the press cycle that followed. The most radical thing Amara Cole ever did was continue being herself, completely, quietly, without apology, in a world that had spent 11 years trying to convince her that she was nothing more than a reflection of someone else. Power doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always come with a boardroom or a press conference or a headline. Sometimes it lives in a woman sitting alone in a dark room, holding a phone, choosing not to act, and understanding, in that choice, that the power was always hers. The question was never whether she had it. The question was when she would decide it was finally enough. What would you have done in her place? Would you have made the call sooner, or would you have held on longer, hoping things would change? Leave your answer in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please like the video right now. It helps more people find these stories and reminds us to keep making them. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. The next story is already in production, and I promise you, it will challenge everything you think you know about loyalty, sacrifice, and what people are capable of when they've been underestimated for too long. Don't miss it.